for the drums.
Hey, Keith. Hey, Jonathan.
Hey,
How are
Rob. Hey,
y'all?
Keith.
Hey, what have you got for us today?
I've got some more stuff in our series about everyday design practices, specifically about everybody's favorite KPIs. Really exciting stuff. You're going to
Woohoo.
love it.
KPIs.
I
Let's
only
do
mean
it.
that in a slightly nerdy way about being excited. But I think you'll see what makes this really cool here once we get into it. But just to sort of recap, though, I wanted to just mention to anybody who might be watching this, we've been talking through this series so far about the design of everyday things in this book by Don Norman and how that applies to dashboard design. So we've talked already in a few episodes about sort of generic design principles and very generic examples with bar charts and hyperlinks and clickability and some of these design principles like affordance and propositional density. Um, this time is when we really get into the start of application to something that we all do every day. So that's really the reason that I'm excited about this. And I think the things um, that are involved with this in multiple layers, there's a lot of keys to visualizing those performance indicators. So, you ready to talk about all the fundamental building blocks of these KPIs?
Am I ever? I'm
We're
I'm really
Yeah.
enthused about this.
we're going to
Yeah.
pick this
Mhm.
apart. We're going to pick apart every single digit, literally every single digit
Okay.
involved in how we do this. But you're going to see why
Mhm.
as we go along, why that's so important to see each of these building blocks. So let's just go through this one. This is a big aggregate number, and you can use different terms for that A in the band statement, whichever you like. But this is a very common thing. Okay. We just need to know those top line totals. This is great for executive views or even just a view where you need to know that total and it needs to be really visible and accessible in addition to whatever else might be on the dashboard. And almost without exception, you need to compare that to something, to anything. Um, So the first part of any of these things is you've got to name what it is you're measuring. Here it's sales, but the sky is literally the limit. Anything that businesses or organizations want to measure can be here. But we have to tell people what it is. It's sort of like that labeling your axis thing. We want to know what's the current value, what's that current total, and has it changed? Or is it above or below some target? And then also, what are we comparing? Here it's year over year, and a lot of people use the YOY acronym to indicate year over year. It could be time based. It could be based on a budget number or plan. Anything. But these are the nuts and bolts. Really are the building blocks for nearly every KPI dashboard I think I've ever seen or personally built. Have you guys seen the same kind of thing? Like these building blocks exist in all of them?
Yeah. The one other one I would, or sort of two other ones I'd add to it, because I'm fairly often working with rates. So that KPI is some sort of percentage or some sort of rate, and the numerator and the denominator are important.
Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
So in that way, but then still there's what is the comparison value. So it's just a little
Mhm.
extra context for that number.
Yeah, a little
Hmm.
additional information for what are you comparing?
Hmm.
Yeah, what are those two
Yeah.
numbers? Sure.
I do occasionally see the need for a definition of what is the metric.
Hmm.
Sales is perhaps self-evident, but
Hmm.
sometimes these KPIs or these things that we're measuring can, especially in a large organization, not necessarily have everybody on the same page with how do we define this thing, what's it comprised of. So sometimes there's just a little short sentence or two underneath that just gives it that sort of qualifying contextual definition.
Yeah. I chuckle a little bit when you say that sales is self-evident. I've been in enough rooms where people are arguing about the definition of what to include in that number that
Right?
maybe it's not so self-evident.
Maybe,
after
right.
all.
Maybe it's not. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. To your point, Keith, for me, when I think about that, I think of it as sort of KPI metadata in a way that oftentimes I have like, okay, what's the super short thing we can put in a band, like sales or profit or what have you, very short, no more than like 20 letters long. And then there's kind of, okay, what is that dictionary name for the KPI? Maybe it has a numeric identifier, particularly if it's like we're working with World Health Organization standards, or in U.S. healthcare, there's like Medicare names and numbers for metrics. And then there's that dictionary definition, which may also extend to what is like, how is that year over year computed? Is that fiscal year, calendar year, some other calendar, for example? There ends up being something like that when we have, if there's some comparison to target, where is that target coming from, and what's the provenance of that? What's the date the data is as of, being another piece for that? What is that current value? Because sometimes we're showing data that's 2 months old.
All of the things that you brought up are the variations on this theme that build on top of the building blocks that I was just showing. They're things that may be optional or necessary depending on a particular business situation, right? So you're going to have that extra labeling. You might have actually include the numerical value for a previous or target, or like Jonathan, you said, the numerator and denominator if you're measuring a rate. Something about time frame. You might include a trend line instead of just the number, and some kind of definition or business logic, right? So one example that comes often when I'm working with accountants is, just looking at invoices paid versus received. And so, how are we marking it as paid, and in what time frame, and all of those kinds of things. So, and all of these things, there are just so many variations on these building blocks. Now, over here on the screen, I also have this just kind of clipped together thing from Luke Stanke, who put together this really great thing on Tableau Public that's just an array of all these different design options that you can use for these little KPI cards. But when you look at it, you really find that they all have those same fundamental building blocks with just a few variations on layout or color, or maybe it adds a spark line, or maybe it has a little bit more definition, and all of those optional things.
So one of the questions I have sometimes, because oftentimes I'm working with people where it's new data, so where the KPIs are still a little fuzzy, and there's the business processes and the what do we do? Like, what do we next when we see that number on the upper left is 36,522 and it's down?
Now what?
Yeah. Now what?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, now you're getting into the detail dashboards, right? Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's important. I mean, I think it is important to say that, here I'm literally just talking about what do we do for that executive summary or that top level row of totals. But yeah, absolutely. The accessibility of more questions, more detail, totally important.
Yep.
So that's what the front end looks like. That's what the basics look like after it's all built, after it's all put together. also really wanted to dive into how do we put it together to actually make that work and work with some efficiency and some flexibility. The problem that I ran into some time ago, and that's talked about a little bit in the Big Book of Dashboards by people I think the two of you know pretty well, Andy
Mhm.
Cotgreave, Jeff Schaefer, and Steve Wexler. They asked me to contribute to the book and describe this problem. Basically, what it was is that it's a really large company that's measuring a lot of things across a lot of different departments. And it's not just dollar figures. Some of them are rates. Some of them are percentages. Some of them are really big numbers, like millions. And some of them are really small, like how many calls per hour in a call center, something like that. So there's this wide variation of units of measurement and rounding levels and definitions of what we're measuring. But we need it to go into a unified view that's very readable, so that we're not going to 5, 6, 10 different dashboards and asking the question, where do I find this number? Um, so this construction that I want to talk about is how to bring multiple types of measurements all together. Have y'all run into situations like that before though, where you're trying to bring a lot of different metrics into one view, but they're from all different data sources and measured all different ways?
Yes, definitely. Especially right now, not so much from the visualization perspective, from the data modeling perspective. We're bringing together KPIs from a lot of different programs. Some of them are percentages, some of them are counts, some are sums, different units of
Hmm.
measure.
Yeah,
But by and large, we can stack all of those things up on a tidy data model and union the programs beneath each other. However, when it comes to those percentage values, if the percentages are at this deeper level of detail, and I want to roll up that percentage to some overall value, I can't just take the average of a bunch of percentages. I need actually the
exactly.
numerators and the denominators in order to compute that
Mhm.
percentage at a different level of detail, which makes me then kind of modify the data model in order to account for those
Yeah,
numerators and those denominators that are going to stick out a little bit from the rest of the data model. So it's not just up in the visualization layer, but it's all the way down to the analytics data model too. How
that's
do we
right.
bring these things together in a way that can make them work withable and tidy and make them fit?
Yeah, and that's a great preview for stuff that I plan to talk more about in a later episode in this same series. Here we're talking about what does it look like on the front end and a little bit about how those fields are constructed. And then as we go along, we'll get even deeper into those data layers and talk about, yeah, how do we get the data model to fit this mold? So here, this is the shiny mold. This is what comes out of the mold. And as we go through this series a little bit more, we'll get all the way into those details.
Okay. I'm
Nice.
glad we're going to talk about this because it's uh, in full disclosure, I've got a chapter in the big book of dashboards as well, and some of my part was this multiple KPI problem, and in that work was literally years in the making because we had a bunch of
Hmm.
new metrics. And I run into this again and again where people will see Tableau and they see the amazing things it can build and they'll think like, oh, I can get this amazing dashboard on day one, but the data and the business processes just aren't there yet.
Mm.
That they're the KPIs are still being defined, or the data is being gathered, or there's not even a structure in place to pull all that data together, like you were talking about, Keith. And so I'm really glad we're going to take time to dive into this because I think it's an area for fruitful discussion and to have content for people who are learning this, who are going through it for that first time.
So I think step one here is to take that band and pick it apart even further than we already have about what are
Mhm.
those fundamental elements of those aggregate numbers. Here I've got several examples lined up in a
Mhm.
very particular way so that you can see that whether we're measuring dollars or yen or percentages or comparisons with the up down arrows and things like that, there's some commonalities. There may or may not be a prefix, typically a currency indicator, but I've seen other things in strange ways. So it could be a currency dollar sign,
Mhm.
or it could be that up down arrow that we see everywhere. So that's the prefix, and that's going to be a string, just
Okay.
a string value of some kind. And in the middle, that's your actual number. It's aggregating some value that we're measuring. And then to the right, you're going to have a suffix. Um, and sometimes you might not have a suffix. If there's no rounding, you wouldn't have. But that's where you're going to have your millions, or for the case of Japanese yen, the currency indicator sometimes goes in the back instead of the front. Your percentage sign, other unit designators like seconds, minutes, hours, counting things, whatever it is you're counting might need to have that units label as a suffix. You've got this prefix, your value, and your suffix.
Can I add one bit to that with
Yeah.
the suffix? Sometimes I've seen it be even, or the suffix sometimes is indicating the direction, the directionality, like whether up is good or down is good.
Yes, like above
Yep.
target, or yeah.
Mhm. Yep.
Yeah. So my point is that with this construction, though, this is what gives us the flexibility we need in order to handle all of that variation. By splitting it out into a string on the front and back and a number in the middle, now we've got a lot of options and a lot more flexibility. In Tableau, if you're only dealing with one measure, you actually have a built-in option here in the number formatting. And sometimes people are surprised when I point this out. So, if this is new to you, hey, maybe you're learning something here. But we can put those unit labels in a suffix. So if we wanted to indicate that it's seconds or up, down, or comparing percentage points, we can put that here in the number formatting. You could use the custom number formatting, like the special strings and stuff, but here it's just really easy out of the box. But again, we're trying to solve the problem of not everything is going to have the same prefix or the same suffix. So we're actually splitting it out into 3 different columns, 3 different calculations fields in Tableau. What this allows you to do is say on a text mark where we're defining those KPIs and how they're displayed, we literally just take those things and stick them together, and we can format them however we want. We can format the strings as bold or not, or gray, so that they fade out a little bit, whatever. But it's just simple formatting at that point. The reason I'm harping on this so much is because before looking at it this way, what I came across as a very common solution was something more like this,
Yeah.
where we're
Whoa.
converting the entire thing into a string. We take that
Mm.
number, convert it to a string, and then do all this logic to say, if that string is this long, it's 12 digits, then we're going to round it to billions, and we're going to take the left 3 characters, and then we're going to add the dollar sign, and it's constructing the string. And the reason that it gets so complicated is because converting a number to a string, and then it's still a number. Treat it
Yeah.
as a number.
And I love what you're doing here, because this recent dashboard that we're building right now is performing so well. It's like butter. It just performs well. And that's
Yeah.
because we have the numbers as a numeric data type, and we're using Unicode characters everywhere we can instead of images. And we're doing every little thing we can to hone the performance. And if you're turning all your numeric values into strings and then performing a bunch of computation on those strings in order to put a B behind it, all of that computation takes time,
Right.
and it's going to slow things down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One of the things, to your point, Keith, one of the things with data structure to avoid all of that computation we're seeing in that calculation is, particularly with prefixes and suffixes, those are very often huge parts of that are standard things that go with the type of KPI. So I hope we'll get into this when we talk about the data modeling part of this.
Mhm.
Is I will have a KPI definition table that it's got like, okay, what is that definition? What's the short name? What's the long name? And then there's those strings are already in the data. So it's not even computation.
Right.
Tableau has to do at runtime.
Right. So you've
Yeah.
got
Right.
a form of a data dictionary for your KPIs, and you can even get
Mhm.
down to the short definition, the long definition, the prefix, the suffix, the unit of measure.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. And then if I do have to do some custom calculation, it becomes a simple case statement with a few lines at best.
You've got it.
Love it.
And
Yep.
I'm getting to that in
Which
just a
gets to
second.
trends and arrows.
We're there.
Yep.
We're
Mhm.
we're on the
Yep.
exact same track. That's
Mhm.
exactly it. But I think you see how just understanding why we break it out into that prefix, number, and suffix, like now all the gears are turning like, wait, I can pre-compute that. I can define it in a data dictionary. I can stick that into a database and not have to write out all the calcs and it be hard coded somewhere in a Tableau workbook and all that kind of stuff. Exactly. Yeah.
Mhm.
So just to show a little bit more practically, just to show a little bit more practically how this looks under the hood when we're constructing a band. We've got the metric name, and then we've got that reference to the current value. And those up-down things actually sometimes might be in two different calculations, so that we can format them differently.
Yeah.
This is a very common thing that happens in things that I build. Almost every band that I build is built this way. There's slight variations here and there depending on the situation. Just to show another variation of how this can work. For those high-level things, this is my example from the multiple KPI metrics chapter, where you've got the spark lines, but you also have those colored indicators for did it meet the target? Was it above, below, good, bad, all of those things. And I like this one here at the bottom right by Luke Stanke because it incorporates a lot of information and it shows those optional elements that we talked about before, where you've got the target line, you've got last year, you've got this year, and they're trended, and they're compared, and they're all in this nice, tidy little space that's readable. It's not overwhelming, but I personally love this because I'm a huge advocate of showing the trend lines rather than just the up downs. Wherever possible, show some longer time horizon, because when I look at an up arrow and say, it's up versus last year, I mean, almost now I almost reflectively say, but what if last year was 2020?
Right. But how? like,
right.
What is the manner in which it's up from last year?
Exactly. Right.
Yeah. Or even if we look at this example by Luke, which I'm also a huge fan of having some sort of trend line or spark line. This number's up 31% over year. That's awesome. It's down compared to last period. If we're looking at that blue line, It's gone down. If we're just showing those up down arrows, we're not seeing that.
I know. Yep.
That
Exactly.
complexity of the data that might be really meaningful. One thing I wanted to go back to on the up-down comparison here and kind of, because this is sometimes for people like, okay, why do we need two separate calculations, one for the up, one for the down, and the change versus prior up, change versus prior down, and because we have color on the marks card. That's something it seemed like we can just drop something in color. And the thing I wanted to call out here is with the color shelf on the marks card, that's going to color the entire label.
Exactly.
And what we want here is we want parts of the label to be colored differently at different times.
Mm-hmm.
And so we end up using separate calculations for those.
Yeah.
And there's no space
Yeah.
in between them, so that when it's up, you get the up version and the other one just disappears, and when it's down, you get the down
Right.
version and the other one disappears, and it's a little bit like magic. Only one is present at a time.
Just to say that there are other solutions that may make sense, but this is the one that I most typically see.
Yeah, what I'm hearing, this is your bread and butter, and what I like is you've systematized the approach all the way through, from the prefix to the suffix and the data model and the computation to the, and now that you have that smart system, you can reuse it again and again, project to project, view to view.
Right. Right. And it helps a lot when you're trying to create a template as well for people to kind of start from and build off of. I describe this as building blocks for a reason, because sometimes what we're doing is creating building blocks for someone else who's on the team and trying to do their own thing.
Yep.
Well, thanks guys so much for this today. I think it was a great discussion, and I'll see you next time.
Me too.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled we're doing this.
Thanks, Robert.
We'll see you next time.
That's great.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Action